dangers of restrictive dieting and why dancers really want to move away from following restrictive food rules as a way to, potentially achieve certain goals that they might have, whether those are like performance goals or body goals. We want to be super careful about the habits that we are starting or creating, because so often if they are centered around restricting foods, whether that's a biological restriction like maybe a low calorie dieting, or maybe that's a psychological restriction like telling yourself you shouldn't be eating a food because it's quote unquote bad for health or anything along those lines, this is where we start to develop very unsustainable habits around food. So a little bit more about me though. I am the face behind the account to the Pointe Nutrition. I started my company back in 2013 as a way to educate dancers about fueling for performance without turning to restrictive food rules. When I was dancing full time over a decade ago, I fell into some pretty unsustainable habits around food. I am open about this. I'm a recovering perfectionist. Okay, so if you follow me over to the Pointe Nutrition, then you know that I'm a bit of a type A perfectionist or recovering one. And over 10 years ago, this led me to unsustainable habits around food. I thought that quote unquote clean eating and building a healthy lifestyle really was the only way to optimize my performance. And while building a balanced plate is a huge part of our performance, we need to make sure our habits around food and around our body are sustainable, right? And are supporting our mental health, our emotional well-being, our spiritual well-being, right? It's not just about optimizing our physical performance. Don't get me wrong, dancers are athletes. Our needs as dancers are actually comparable to those of an athlete. I'm also a licensed and certified specialist in sports nutrition. This is because as dancers, we do need to implement the principles of sports nutrition in order to support our increased needs as very active individuals. But if you have that little bit of type A perfectionism in you, you can be at risk for falling into some disordered eating habits. And this is exactly what we want to prevent. Okay. And in regards to the consequences, in regards to what I'm really breaking down today, we are thinking about the biological consequences and the psychological consequences of restrictive dieting. So biologically, if we're not providing our body with the tools it needs to support its metabolic functioning, so this is essentially the functioning that you don't see on the outside, right? This is not our performance. This is our reproductive system working, right? This is getting a regular menstrual cycle. This is our heart beating, sleeping at night to support its metabolic needs. I call it an internal metabolic flame that's constantly burning to support your inner needs, the inner workings of your body. Well, if you're not supplying your body with enough energy from food to support those needs, things are going to start to happen, right? Your body is not going to have the tools it needs to support appropriate hormonal production. Hormones play a huge role in bone health. Have you ever experienced consistent stress fractures? Do you find yourself sitting out from classes and from jumps more often than not? We need to really reassess how your bone health is doing and if your diet and your food choices is actually supporting building strong bones. Now, peak bone building years, this is usually between the ages of like 12 and 22. But with that being said, for any dancers over the age of 22, guess what? Your bones are still remodeling. You need those nutrients, right? For a lifetime, we need to be thinking about bone health. And so often we tend to only think about like calcium and vitamin D when it comes to bone health, and those are super important. We want to incorporate foods on our plate that are great sources of calcium and vitamin D. But we also need to make sure we're eating enough. If we are not providing our body with enough calories during the day, if we're not eating enough sources of fat during the day, then your body's not going to be able to utilize those various vitamins and minerals to support strong bones. Okay, so in regards to these biological consequences, we also want to be on the lookout for something called relative energy deficiency in sport. You might have heard this as red S. This doesn't only affect female dancers, this affects all dancers across the board can be affected by the hormonal damage of restrictive dieting. We want to make sure we are providing our body with the tools, aka the calories it needs to support that metabolic functioning. Consequences of red S involve extreme irritability, decreased bone density, lack of concentration in class. We even see depression, increased levels of anxiety. There is a plethora of consequences that can be experienced on the biological level when it comes to not supplying our body with adequate tools. Now, those are the consequences of biological consequences of food restrictions. What about the psychological consequences of food restrictions? So, as humans, I often say this, if you've ever heard of the phrase, the grass is always greener on the other side, I think this is such a great way of describing how we feel when we are restricting ourselves on certain types of food. Humans, just as natural beings, are curious, right? We always want what we think we can't have. So if you're telling yourself that you cannot eat something or you should not be eating something for reasons of XYZ, most commonly we hear this maybe for reasons you don't think it's healthy, you don't think it's nourishing, you will immediately risk that voice in the back of your head, right? That craving of that food that you are restricting. This is usually why we experience cravings. Cravings actually are experienced on the biological hormonal level. Our body does send signals out if it's not getting adequate amounts of carbohydrates and fats. There's a whole host of hormonal communications happening within our body. But also psychologically, when we think we can't have something, we want it more. So these are the two main themes of why restrictive dieting just doesn't work. 98% of restrictive diets do not work long term. 98%, that's a lot. Okay, if this isn't reason for you to quit dieting, I don't know what is. But if you're thinking to yourself right now, well, what about that 2% that it does work for? Well, let me tell you something about that 2%. The 2% of people who maybe, quote unquote, you feel dieting works, they are most often partaking in very disordered eating, taking away from other aspects of our life. Food is such an integral part of our cultural identity, of our social identity, of having fun, of partaking in experiences. This is something that's so important for dancers, because if you're not bringing experiences to the stage, then how are you adding depth to your artistry? Right? So it's not just about what food plays for our physical performance, it's also about what food plays for our mental performance, allowing you to free the mental weight of what dieting and food restrictions can bring upon you. That's how you will flourish in your artistry on stage as well, okay? Hope you've liked this short, sweet, and, for lack of a better pun, to the point explanation of why I do not recommend dieting for dancers. Restrictive eating, disordered eating, eating disorders, we want to try and instead build a lifestyle that promotes sustainable habits around food and around our body.